Sunny Bonani, fashion peeps. So I'm going to carry on with these pants and I'm putting in the fly over here. This is just my version. Obviously, there's a million different ways to do it. This is just mine. So pieces wise, got the fronts here, and this notch here for me is usually when you transition from the straight to the curve. That's why I um, notch my notch. Each pattern has their own version. That's just where I do mine. And then on the zip side, I have half a centimeter extra. So usually how I do, obviously I'm cutting this in one, cutting this on the on the double. Then this has the extra cut on there, and then I come back and I trim that half a centimeter off. Then overlocking wise, I always overlock just this portion up until where the notch is or where that extra little groove is. In this case, I've got the lining. Obviously, if you don't have that, no one's going to die. But what I'm going to do for this side where the zip is coming, I'm just going to go ahead and do a stay stitch there, just to keep the lining and the trouser together. Then what I've got is my fly piece, which will come onto this side for a gent, and the fly guard. So these also I cut in one, and the fly, I suppose you call this fly facing, is just cut a little bit less. The fly guard is about 1.5, 2 centimeters extra here, and then a little bit extra here. Honestly, I don't know why I do that because I end up trimming it in any event, but that's neither here nor there. And I just have a notch here that is going to line up with this notch. This notch has now been overlocked away, so I'm just going to see if I can see it there and just draw that in. Obviously a notch, that is why I put this tailor's tack there, so that the notch is easier to see. Then for a lining for this, right sides together, I take this on the bias. Here at the top, I cut a little bit extra, and then here at the top, 3 centimeters extra. Here at the bottom, 1.5 centimeters extra, and then I just go straight for about 15 centimeters. Kind of depends on the fabric, what the fabric will allow me. This isn't great. You'll see later. It isn't the best pattern, but it works. So for me, it's the easiest one. And right now, I just don't have the mental energy to figure out a new thing. So I just go with what I know. And then for this trouser specifically, I'll be using this, I don't know, crotch guard, seat guard, I don't know what you'll call it. You don't really have to use this. This actually works totally fine, this portion. But you'll see all this is, I cut it from a shablon, but you'll see it's really just that portion of the back extended a little bit to the front. So you can trace that off. This is just, one that I have for years. So I just use the same one. It is on the bias here, so you don't really have to overlock. Or, here I just cut it with a zigzag. If I can, I do that. And in this case, I like to line with a cotton, but if I was using this acetate, I would just do a double layer because there's no chance I can cut that with a zigzag. And it is very thin, so I would double layer that. But in any event, we're just going to go step by step, piece by piece. You see here what I've done is I've put a binding just around the edge here for fashion. Of course, you can't overlock that if you don't want to do the binding. So on this portion, which is the left side for a gent, ladies obviously going to do this the other way around. It's going to match my notch. And now, depending on how cowboy I feel that day, sometimes I'll just cut this a little bit extra, especially if I'm doing, like a big and a small trouser. I'll just cut it the same. I'll cut two bigs rather than one small, one big, and then just extend it over here, as long as this notch is matching. And you'll see what I'm doing here. I'm not putting it right on the edge. I'm putting it a little bit back from the edge. My seam allowance here is 1 centimeter. And I'm going to stitch 1 centimeter from this outside edge. As you know, with bespoke, always trying to get everything nice and smooth and soft. And this is the one big difference between what we do and what happens in the factories, is that we're able to do things like this, where we just mismatch a little bit. I'm just gonna notch that so that these layers fall on top of each other easier, which allows there not to be so many seams ending on exactly the same spot. So it will just make it a little bit smoother. So I'm going to stitch that at 1 centimeter seam allowance from the edge there. I'm going to stitch there. I'm going to stop at this notch. Again, I don't really know how important that is, but I do it because this is how I've been doing it for years, and I don't really have the energy right now to figure out, is it actually all that important? So maybe you can let me know. You can do some testers and see what happens. All right, so there I've stitched it, leaving that little edge open. I'm just going to go ahead and do a top stitch here. Sometimes I will notch just this fly facing to that notch so that it can sit out nicely like that. Sometimes not, depends how I feel on the day. So I'm just going to do an understitch onto the fly facing, so that it can turn around nice and smoothly over there. So there we are. I've just done an understitch there, iron that back. This little flap here is loose. Sometimes I don't cut it so that it's easier for it to tuck away like that. Doesn't really matter. Like I say, depends how I feel on the day. So now here I'm going to match up this crotch point, but I'm not going to stitch all the way to the edge. For now I'm just matching it. And now I know that, you know, if I flip this up, this piece had the extra 1/2 centimeter seam allowance. So if I look at it from the top, I can mismatch it more or less 1/2 centimeter. I don't know if this is all that necessary, but it makes me feel better, so that's why I do it. And I'll check here, I'll just put a pin through there. And see, that's about 1/2 centimeter in front of the underside. So I feel like this is now more or less meshed up. You know, the two fronts are now more or less meshed up exactly, given the fact that this piece is about 1/2 centimeter ahead of underside. So that's all matched up. So now here, whatever my seam allowance is, I need to double that. Seam allowance is 1.5. So I need to do 3 centimeters, and so I'm going to do around 4, just so that there's easy space. So there's 4. I'm going to start stitching here, and from the top edge here, my seam allowance is 1 centimeter. So I'm going to carry on 1 centimeter, but I'm actually going to stitch on the other side. I'm going to put just a double pin here, so I know this is where I'm stopping. And you see here, you can see where now the original stitch was that joined the fly facing. So we're going to make sure this extra portion of the fly is out of the way. And I'm going to come, now I'm going to start here and just kind of join that. So I'll start maybe 2 stitches up so that this line is actually one line. And how I do, I stitch to the bottom, I turn around and I come back, stitch to the top. And here I'll do a bit of a back stitch so that this portion is quite strong, and we've got a double stitch here around the crotch. And that double stitch will continue the whole crotch. I always double stitch. So yeah, I'm just going to do it from the side and make sure that then, you know, this line that joined the fly guard is exactly, you know, just carries on smoothly into the crotch. Let me go and do that. Here it is. And you see here, I like to do it with this method because that means that this line here, there's just one smooth straight line. We don't have like a weird kink there trying to join it, you know, up to that point with a notch or anything like that. So then I'm going to go in here and just pull out this basting. I want to do it now before it becomes really difficult to do, because now it serves its purpose. I don't want to leave it there right to the end once I've stitched 100 other things there. Okay, last little piece. There we go. Right. So now I quite like this piece with the zip to be that 1/2 centimeter longer, because that means it's easier to have the zip tucked in underneath the fly there, because now the seam allowance gives us that 1/2 centimeter extra. So I'm going to place my zip. I'm going to put this metal stopper just above the end of my stitching, so that actually it's in a way visible here in the opening. So basically the bottom of this metal stopper is in line with where I've stopped stitching to join these two together. Can be a little bit up, can be a little bit down. I don't think it's really a crime. This is, like I say, this is just the way that's been working for me. And right now, it is not going to get changed until I take some time to really rethink it. But it works. So there we go. Okay, so I'm just going to stitch this on the edge, or the edge of the zip fabric, lining up with the edge of my trouser fabric there. And then I'm going to come with my fly guard and stitch it one time like this. Again, I'm going to mismatch it, and this one I'm also going to cheat a little bit, bring it up there, and just see how is the notch. Now I know where that notch was. That's where I stopped stitching. That notch, yeah, reasonably in the right place. It's totally fine. If I have to bring it up a little bit, it's not a drama. You'll see why being a little bit high is actually a good idea. And like I say, here again, mismatching those seams a little bit, just so we don't have 500 seams ending in one spot. I'm going to stitch this up until like next to the metal stopper. So right here where I put the metal stopper, just stitching up until that point, kind of in the middle of it, not top or bottom. And I'm going to stitch sort of how my machine foot will allow me, because my machine foot won't allow me to get too close here unless I use a zip foot, which I won't do. I'll be using a regular foot. So it will be about 1/2 centimeter from the edge of this seam, edge of the trouser. I'll just go with my foot to see how far I can get, but it won't be able to get closer than 1/2 centimeter to the teeth of the zip, which is great because it means the slider can still pass up and down quite easily. And you see that will just flip open like that. Obviously there's the pins here now, and there will be the zip there with the fly guard at the back. So I'm going to go and do that. There we have it. I just stitched that along. I actually ended up stitching with the zip foot a little bit closer there because I just felt it was a bit too far away from the zip. But you see there's still quite a bit of space between the fabric and the zip. So I've just ironed it flat that way. And the slider of the zip can really just glide nice and easily. And this bottom of the stopper lines up. This is actually a little bit far away, should have been a little bit further down, but just lines up with the top of the end of my stitching there. I'd rather have it a little bit high than too low, because the stitching here, you don't want to slam your needle into that. So yeah, from there is a way to do this kind of one time when you have the waistband on and then you put this lining. But I don't do like that for a couple of reasons. Number one being that this works better with the fitting process because I do bespoke. So it's easier for me to finish this front portion with the fly, etc., and then have a temporary waistband fit with the client, and then do whatever adjustments and then finish the waistband, versus having to finish the waistband one time with everything else, and then my only adjustment option is there at the center back. So here with this lining, I'm going to go just till as we start curving there. I really can't say where exactly, it's just as we start curving. I'm just going to stop over here. Now this one I've matched exactly the same here, because this, you can see this portion of the fly guard is quite a bit up from the rest of the trouser. If it wasn't, if it was more glace here, I would have mismatched this to be a little bit higher up. You'll see why once we turn it. But for now, I'm just going to go from here where it starts curving a little bit, and I'm going to do just under a machine foot. So I'm going to do maybe 4 mils to stitch this lining. And from there, I'll just turn it around like that. Obviously not huge like that. I'll just flip it around, and you see here, because it's on an angle, it has a tendency to come lower on the back side. Now, because I have so much extra here, and I know also in this gentleman's case, we're cutting the waistband a little bit skew. So I know I have enough here that I don't have to stress too much. But if this was more gouache here, then I would have put my lining a little bit higher so that when it comes around to the back, this mismatch would be at the top. But in this case, it's not going to matter because the mismatch is down at the bottom, or because the fly guard itself is further up. So let's go stitch that. Okay, having stitched this lining about 4 mils and then ironed it over around like this. And you can see here, the more severe your angle, the more obvious this will become. That when you fold it around like this, it just goes a little bit down. So that's why I mismatched it there, or I would mismatch it there if this wasn't so high up in the waistband. And you'll see, you'll see later on, but I may as well show you now. When this closes, in this case, I have an angle here. So if we keep this part of the fly guard straight, it then ends up actually here being too low. You can see that. So that is why I make this fly guard a little bit high, so that later on I'll go to cut it in the same shape as this. In this case, this is not a square here. Sometimes if I do a stripe, then I'll make sure that I have a square here, and then I won't have this situation. But in this case, because it's plain, I do put some shape here because that gives us shape here. And of course, we need that shape here for a gentleman. So that's why this fly guard is up there. Then you'll see you're going to iron it over like this. I do it like this just because, I don't fold it all the way back like that because it gives us some fash over there, and it's also more flat than if I'd gone all the way back. That would give me a bit of bulk there. And you'll see here, it kind of fun self folds over like this. So what I've done here, this at the end of the day just kind of becomes like a bias binding. So I just ironed my center so I know where it is, and ironed that portion straight to the center, and you see it just kind of smoothly transitions into that shape. This portion I'll get to in a moment, but the first thing that I'll do from here is just stitch in the ditch down to there. So let me go and do that. I just stitched that in the ditch to around where the curve is. Then I've already gone ahead and ironed this portion up. So here I wanted to cover this loose edge and also turn back far enough that on this side I can do a stitch right on the edge of this fabric with a sharp needle. Stitch here that will catch that turn under, so it doesn't end up just flapping out again, because what would be the point of that? In this case, because the zip is quite far from the fabric, I don't really want to put a top stitch here, because then it's going to be difficult for me to close the zip without exposing that top stitch. I will be able to, because that's how this is designed, that there's more seam allowance underneath. So I'll be able to close that quite easily, but it will still be a little bit close to the edge, so that just a little bit of pressure and perhaps you see a top stitch there. Very unfashionable. So in this case, I'll rather stitch down here, just in that ditch. And of course, again, that is going to catch the turn under there. And actually, what you could also do is just stitch this a little bit closer to the edge of the zip teeth. Still make sure the slider can go. And then if it's that closed, I'm going to stitch on this fabric to prevent it from accidentally slipping in underneath the slider of the zip. So I did all of that, just ironed that under, and then you'll see it kind of continues down this length, and then I just folded it to the center there, so that this becomes a nice long little strip there. And this, yeah, I really don't know what is the point of cutting that longer, because I always end up just cutting it shorter again. So anyway, here I'm just going to pin this in place. You know how much I love pins. You don't have to be a lover of pins if you don't want to, but if your work is not neat, that is going to be your very first way to neaten up your work, is just by using pins more consistently. So yeah, I'm going to just give that a little stitch in the ditch over there. And then here, depending on how I feel on the day, but usually 9 times out of 10, I will top stitch this, hand stitch this, usually with a whip stitch, just onto the lining. Of course, if you don't have a lining, that's not going to work. So then I make sure this is overlocked, otherwise it ends up fraying out like this. But yeah, I've just overlocked the fly guard, and now I'm going to just top stitch, just whip stitch that portion of the lining closed. So there I've just stitched right next door against the zip, and stopping at the bottom of this middle stopper. Now actually I noticed that on this previous one I have stitched on the fabric even though it's wide, and you see here, because of that mismatch with the seam allowance, you really don't stress so much about the stitching showing, because when it's closed up that folds nicely over. But in any event, that's how it goes, and now I'm just going to go along and hand stitch that with the whip stitch. You can see here I've done it on this one just to close that lining. So let me go ahead and do that. The next thing I'm going to do after that, from here I like to do everything on a form. For me, it just is a bit safer to mimic the shape of the body while I'm working. So here I make sure that that is lying where it should lie, according to the seam allowances that have been seamed and allowed. So that's on a 1.5, this is on a 1, and that's going to be lying straight. And I make sure that this covers nicely the edge there, and that this is folding in one smooth line. You know, I don't want to have a weird kink there. So just going to pin that in. I don't know why I'm having a weird little bubble there. So there's my 1 centimeter, there's my half. So that should fold. This is a very finicky portion. There we go. Just want this portion to be straight. So we have one straight line going down the crotch, through the center back seam, all the way into the waistband. So I'm just going to pin this, like I said, over. And I know that here it should be around 1/2 centimeter over. I'm going to bring it all the way to 1 centimeter, just to make sure that everything is covered nicely, maybe 3/4 centimeters, because there's always going to be a bit of tension on the trouser, and we don't want, as it lifts up a little bit, to then see this up. So there, everything's lying nice and smooth. One very important thing here is that you want to position the slider where it's going to be at the end of the day. So, the seam allowance here that I have is 1.5 centimeters. So I'm positioning the slider there, because you see this portion of the zip is now coming out here. If I stitch everything closed like that, all nice and neat, and then at the end of the day, when I finish and the slide is here, it's actually going to push this portion out, and what you're going to end up seeing is that little bit of the zip here at the top. So just position your slider where it's going to be at the end of the day. And then you can flip this side and grab just the fly and the zip and just pin that together. So here I'm also going to stitch twice, once more or less in the middle of the fabric and once on the edge. So here I'm just doing a few pins, checking the side again, that everything is lying nice and flat. And if I take this out, is that going to lie where I want it to? Yes. So again, not just to the bottom of the metal stopper there. Like I said, 2 lines. One middle of the fabric, one on the edge of the fabric, and I'm going to hand stitch that closed. There you can see I've just stitched twice there. Now what I'm going to do is fold this where it wants to fold. Just do a little bit of pinning here from the wrong side. So here we are going to be stitching through, but I like to baste this section. So you see here, because of that cut in the fly facing, it just lies nice and neat there. And you see this, we haven't stitched, you're able to flip that up. Now, here I'm just pinning this kind of however it wants to lie. Not forcing it anywhere. And sometimes I do find a bit of a mismatch up here. Kind of depends what's been going on. But that is why I always have a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance here on the waistband, so that I'll just be caught in. Just going to look on this side that I don't have any funny pulls anywhere. That's looking fine. And then, you know me, how much I absolutely love basting. Find the needle I want, but whatever. I usually baste in a contrasting color this portion, but since I just have navy on this needle anyways, here I'm going to do 3 times in one spot because I want this to be quite stable. And I'm just going to baste along here. So as I say, usually I'll do this with a contrasting thread so that from the right side it's very easy to see my line. So here I'm really stitching, just right on the edge of this fly guard or fly, no, I think this is the fly facing, you know what I'm talking about. So that from the right side, I really have a good idea of where is the edge, where can I stitch up to. You can obviously do this by pins, I'm just extra, as you know. Just stitching that along. Nothing too exciting. And again, just 3 stitches in one space just to give it a nice bit of security down here. So, from the right side now, it's going to be tough to see on the camera because it's navy. But like I say, usually this is in a contrasting color, so it's very easy for me to see. And then I'll just draw this out straight as I can. And I usually do about 4 centimeters if that is going to work with my stitching. Here I'm going to do maybe 3.5, 3.75, somewhere there. Just going to draw that in. Really should be sharpening this chalk, but anyways. And I come down to the join line here, to that spot where I joined earlier. And this I just go with my eyes to make a shape that is fashion. I don't use a shablon or anything here. So on the inside you'll see, and you can always test it, you can just see where is this going to stitch, and it does need to be underneath the metal stopper. You don't want to be too close here. This is reasonably fine. I might have to stitch a little bit under that. The machine will really guide me there. So I'm going to flip all of this up. These 2 pieces of the zip, that portion of the fly facing or the fly guard, whatever you want to call it, this situation, all of that's up and out the way. This is going to be out the way. I'm going to stitch this one time, down to here. And I'm going to feel with my machine, if my foot doesn't want to come this close, I'll just go a little bit further down. But generally, I want to come back to that join line. And you see the zip's going to be perfectly hidden underneath there. Fantastic. So there we have it. I've just stitched that last portion of the zip done. I can pull this this basting out now. When I'm doing a fitting, I'll usually leave this in just to show the client how much we love him, that we go for all of this hand stitching. But these trousers have already been fitted. This is actually the second one I'm doing. So obviously I'll erase that chalk mark, and you see here the machine foot didn't really want to go so close to all of that bulk, so I just came a little bit lower down, no stress. And here at the top you can see when the zip is closed to there, I've just marked where is my actual line of the top of the zip here, so that when I put my waistband, I don't all of a sudden have this mismatching anywhere. And the last thing I'm going to do here is just put a bar tack just down the bottom there, just for strength. You can see this one is a little bit further along. There, just a little bar tack there. And here I've already put the waistband on. You can see here in the waistband, I don't fuse, so I've got just a layer of cotton over there, and then a layer of horsehair, just to keep this nice and straight. This I've just flipped back and stitched here. I did put a seam here, because that seam allowance here helps to keep this portion nice and straight. And then here, I just do it in a bit of a shape, so that it kind of follows the shape of this fly guard. In this case, I'm just going to put a button here and then one here, so that here in the center there's actually not going to be any buttons or anything like that. And that actually helps if someone has a bit of a stomach. This can kind of be uncomfortable, kind of like push. So you don't want a button or a clasp or anything here. So depending on the person, I'll decide if I put a hook and bar here, or if I just do the two buttons, obviously this one on the inside. So I'm going to go ahead and put the shirt catch in here, and you'll see this portion. Obviously later, once I've gotten the shirt catch and all of that, I'll stitch this all one time from the crotch up to the center back. And then this, you see, this portion actually will just cover all of that. So see, the pattern itself, it has a bit, you see that bubble there. So we could have actually shaped this or shaped it that way. But because it's a bias, it's not really such a drama. And then also in this case, what I'll do is I'll just come to maybe, just covering the front of this seam allowance from the center of the legs. And then we'll put this on. So it will go like so, attach, flip. That will attach down at the inside leg, and then this will attach like that onto the seat here, like so. So I think that's basically that. I'll just finish this off and maybe do a last image. And that is how I do the fly. Right, so there we have it. This is now the other trouser that I finished. Finished up the waistband, everything there, put the buttons, etc. Here the back of the waist, or the center back, you can see this is now done in one. From here all the way up to here. One thing I did forget to say is that here on the fly guard, you have to just stitch it down on this piece of the fly facing that's a little bit loose. So this then is kind of closed this way. It's not going to flap open the whole time. And now I'm just going to finish off this last little piece. See there, I have that little bubble there. I just kind of go with it. So I'm going to go just to, just before this seam here. I'm going to cut that with a zigzag so everything's nice and soft. This I'm going to do by hand. Just because the hand stitching, it's a little bit more movable. So it's a little bit more comfortable, especially in this rather delicate region. So let's see. going to take a double cotton. So like I said, sometimes, depending on the price, really, I'll just take this piece to behind the inside leg seam there. And also, again, depending on the price, sometimes I'll just do it by machine one time. I'll just stitch all the way to there. But for this one, this is really one of the high-end suits that we do. So here I'm going to take extra time to make it extra fabulous and just have a knot randomly in the middle of nowhere. Yeah. So just stitching that in there. Nothing too exciting. I'm going to just stitch another one a little bit higher up, kind of in between where the fly ends and where the inside leg seam is. Right here. All right. Then I'm going to take this fly guard section, position this over to where I want it. This kind of join so that it's in a way lining up with the center of the center of that seam where the inside leg is. Same kind of stitch. Obviously, I could have done this one time with that bias section, but I like everything to be perfect, so I'll just do it separately. This thing going to flap back like so. I'm going to put it here. You know, you can, if you want to be very fancy, let's do it. Flip that up a little bit and stitch it on the inside. I'm really not in the mood to do that right now. So I'm just going to stitch like this. So I should just double check that I'm not making that too tight. Of course, same on the other side. Make sure I'm not doing it too tight. And then getting back here to the center, back, again flip it under a little bit, make sure nothing's too tight. And then I'll do, let me just bring that out a little bit so that it kind of matches the width of that. And I am going to do one final fitting with this guy. So I haven't finished up the waistband or the hems. Otherwise, I want basically everything to be done so that we can fit. It should be perfect, and then I can really just do the last few things. Here we go. This version of the crotch guard also really helps to protect the fabric, because here, this is where you get a lot of friction from walking around. So this, because it's movable, it glides over the fabric, so you don't end up with this portion rubbing against itself too much and then wearing out here. So that's a good reason why I like doing it like this on the more luxury levels. So yeah, that's that. I hope this has helped to put together a fly front for you. Where's another? Yeah, fashion baby.